Morning, guys. Invite you to join me in prayer before we get started here looking at the book of Obadiah. Father, we are so thankful for your word, thankful for TES, thankful for the faculty, the instructors, the classes we have, thankful for the chance to sharpen our skills, thankful for the chance to learn how to better understand your word to teach your people. Please give us open ears, understanding mind, and soft, changeable hearts as we look at your word tonight, this morning. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to look at the book of Obadiah, one of the minor prophets. It offers hope amidst suffering, amidst desolation, amidst betrayal, amidst devastation, and tells us God is aware of the suffering of his people. He will fully and finally deal with all who oppose him and all who oppose his beloved people. We'll see the eternal king who punishes sin, executes vengeance on behalf of his people, and keeps all of his promises. So we might ask a question about the author. Who is Obadiah? We honestly don't know much about the author of this book beside his name. There are several Obadiahs mentioned throughout the Old Testament. But none of them really fit the timing or the prophetic activity of this Obadiah. So we don't know much about him. As far as the time this book is written, though, there are several possibilities. I believe it was likely written soon after the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586 BC. Jerusalem's inhabitants were captured and carried off to Babylon, or they'd fled to the surrounding countryside, abandoning the ransacked city of Jerusalem. At this time, many of Israel's neighboring nations were complicit in the calamity. They didn't come to Israel's defense. They didn't help. Some were even perversely pleased with what Babylon was doing. In the aftermath, these nations took advantage of the situation. They plundered the ruins and captured some of the Israelites who were seeking to escape. These opportunists killed some of the survivors, and others handed over those survivors to Babylon. And one of these treacherous nations was Edom, a nation located southeast of Israel, near the Dead Sea. A psalm was written from captivity in Babylon, which cries out against Edom's action during this time, saying, "Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations." And this is the answer to that plea. That psalmist pleading that the Lord remember the wrong is done to his chosen people by Edom. This is the answer to that. So the target of Obadiah's prophecy is Edom. It stands alone, the book of Obadiah, in that it is addressing a foreign nation in its entirety. There is references and perhaps some calling to Judah, calling to the people of Israel, but by and large, this is directed toward the foreign nation. It brings to mind the idea of Jonah and how he was sent to bring a message of judgment coming to Nineveh. And this would be along the lines of that kind of message that Jonah would have brought. So Edom had participated in the plundering of Israel. Who were the Edomites? Where did they come from? Well, the Edomites were descendants of Jacob's brother Esau, and there was a long history of hostility between the two nations. It started with the twins Jacob and Esau, sons of Isaac, who was son of Abraham, and Jacob and Esau's selfish striving against each other. This conflict continued through their offspring for generations, and throughout the pages of Scripture, we get glimpses, little vignettes of the bad blood between their descendants. And it all culminates here in Obadiah. We see the end of the conflict. We see what results. A small side note as we get underway, Obadiah addresses Edom directly through the book, twice using the name Edom and several times using the name Esau. I will also be using the names interchangeably. So Edom, same as Esau. With that background given, I want to give a preview of where we're going to go as we open the book of Obadiah this morning. We're going to see three confident declarations of God's future activity. And these declarations will cultivate restful assurance in God's people. Three confident declarations of God's future activity which cultivate restful assurance in his people. To break it down a bit further, the first confident declaration we'll see is that God will comprehensively punish sin. And we'll see that in verses 1-9. The second declaration is that God will carry out loyal vengeance on behalf of his beloved. And that's in verses 10-16. The final declaration of God's future activity is that God will bring about complete fulfillment of his promises. And we'll see that in 17-21. So we'll see three confident declarations of God's future activity, which should cultivate in us, God's people, a restful assurance. God will comprehensively punish sin. He will carry out loyal vengeance on behalf of his beloved, and God will bring complete fulfillment to his promises. So let's go ahead and crack the book open, look at verses 1-9 to see how God will comprehensively punish sin. First, we're going to see God's raising up of the means of punishment of sin. The book opens with Yahweh summoning the nations to war against Edom. Verse 1, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says Yahweh God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from Yahweh, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise up against her for battle. This summons is a plain reminder that kingship belongs to Yahweh, and he rules over the nations. As Psalm 22:28 says, he orders them around and they obey, often unwittingly, often without their direct knowledge. We'll see here in Obadiah that God directs and uses the nations to accomplish his goal of punishing Edom. Verse 2 begins to tell us how far the punishment will go. Yahweh declares, behold, I will make you, speaking of Edom, small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. They will be gutted, ruined, and decimated. Not only that, they'll be hated, reviled, and shunned by all. Full humiliation is promised as punishment. However, as things stand at the beginning of this message, Edom is puffed up with pride. We'll see in verses 3 and 4 that they put their trust in the fortifications of their land. And we see part of what the offense is that God is bringing the punishment for. In verses 3 and 4, we'll see they've put their trust in the fortifications of their land. They thought they were secure and invincible because they had built up their nation in a mountainous region. They lived in cities that could only be reached through narrow, winding passages. The Edomites thought they were unassailable and no adversary could reach them. We see in verse 3, their pride is high and lifted up, matching their geographical position. Yahweh says in verse 3, the pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? But God is not impressed with their natural defenses. Even if they were in the most unreachable place on earth, once God decides to bring them down, nothing can prevent that from happening. Yahweh declares the folly of trusting in fortification to avoid his punishment in verse 4. Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares Yahweh. He goes and he takes it further. He says, oh, you're in the mountains? Well, even if you were amongst the stars, I will bring you down. There is nowhere I cannot reach. The extensive nature of God's punishment is seen in verses 5-6. It tells us more. Obadiah recounts, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed. Would they not steal only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? How Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. So here God compares his coming punishment to thieves and grape gatherers in order to illustrate the extensive nature of his punishment. Thieves don't strip a house down to its studs, and grape gatherers take only the best, leaving the undesirable parts behind. But not so with Yahweh. He will execute total devastation. His wrath against sin is a consuming fire. Now, as you all know, there's no quotation marks in the original Hebrew. So it's conjecture here, but I think the aside in verse 5 could be Obadiah's stunned interjection upon seeing the complete destruction the Lord is revealing to him. He exclaimed, how you have been destroyed. I think there's some awe at the picture the Lord is revealing to him. It's just total and devastating. Verse 6 echoes the astonished observation, how Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. Obadiah sees there is nothing left once God has levied his judgment for their sin. His punishment is thorough, complete, and devastating. At this point, though, Edom might be tempted to say, we don't only trust in our natural fortifications, we have powerful allies. We have Babylon, and look what they did to Judea. Well, God sits in heaven and laughs. He declares the folly of trusting in human allies. In verse 7, he says, all your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. They don't suspect a thing, in other words. The trust Edom has in its allies is woefully misplaced. Treaties are meaningless if God decides to turn a nation against you. As Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream in the water of the hand of Yahweh. He turns it wherever he will. Not only that, but Edom's allies are, as Isaiah says, a drop from a bucket, accounted as dust on the scales. Military might has nothing on what the Lord is able to do. When he controls the heart of a king, controls the nations of armies, there's nothing defensively that can withstand his punishment. There's no help that Edom's allies can offer. In fact, God says they are going to be the instrument God uses to punish them. They don't have a clue. So we saw in verses 3-4, God tells Edom they can't trust their fortifications. Verse 7 says they can't trust their allies. And now in verses 8-9, we'll see that they can't trust their own wisdom or their own might. Let's read. Will I not on that day, declares Yahweh, destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of Mount Esau? And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Tanan, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. You see, when God brings penalty for sin, there's nothing that can prevent it. No amount of wisdom, no amount of might can stay Yahweh's flood of justice. Verses 1-9 have shown us how God will comprehensively punish Edom's sin. But the sure testimony of Scripture is that the day of the Lord is coming, where all sin will be dealt with fully and finally. So these pictures can serve as a picture. These verses serve as a picture of how God will comprehensively punish all sin, and that there's no defense against God's coming judgment, which in and of itself does not seem to be a declaration of God's future activity, which cultivates hope in his people, cultivates restful assurance. No, that's not the message we're getting here. Sure, there's some comfort to be had from knowing that God brings justice and vengeance to sinners, to the proud, but aren't you prideful? Aren't we all sinners? Don't we all deserve punishment for sin? How does this provide restful assurance for us? We are sinners, absolutely. The Edomites serve as an illustration of how our pride works. We put our trust for being secure, for salvation, for security in all sorts of things. I want you to think seriously about what you put your trust in, what you proudly put your trust in for peace, for security, for salvation. Is it what your body is able to do? Are you healthy? Are you strong? Your possessions, your family, your education, your accomplishments, your job, the nation you live in, your possessions? What about your friendship? Maybe you have some powerful politician friends that'll keep you from the consequences of your actions. We naturally look to ourselves and what we can do or what we have done, who we are, but it's nothing. Nothing can provide that security. We could look at our bank account and think, well, I can cover all my bills. I can buy anything I want. We look at our power, our influence. All these things are not guaranteed to last. It doesn't matter how strong, wise, prosperous you are. It doesn't matter how powerful your family or friends are. It doesn't matter how many good works you've done. None of our possessions, none of our characteristics, none of our accomplishments can prevent God's rightfully punishing us for our sin. We must not imitate Edomites' arrogant attitude, but instead humbly recognize the futility of making anything but God our source of security or peace. As we know, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And how do we humble ourselves? But by admitting our foolish pride to him, admitting that we've put our trust in faulty things, temporal things, the things he's given us even. And by throwing ourselves on his grace and mercy, we place our trust in someone who has taken the punishment that he will give out. He's taken that punishment that we rightly deserve. We humbly receive his grace as an undeserved, unearned, unmerited gift. And when we do this, we find that Jesus took God's comprehensive punishment for our sin. God's wrath against our treasonous sin was fully absorbed at the cross. Though we deserve the same treatment that the Edomites are promised here in these verses, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Therefore, the confident declaration that God will comprehensively punish sin, here in verses 1-9, can cultivate restful assurance in his people because Christ took that punishment for us, for his people, in our place. But beyond their prideful hearts thinking they were unconquerable, what issue did God have against Esau? What exactly had they done? Well, these are the questions verses 10-16 answer. It's here in 10-16 we find God opposes not just the proud, but he opposes those who have opposed his people. And so in verses 10-16, we'll see the next confident declaration of God's future activity, which will cultivate restful assurance in his people. It's that God will carry out righteous vengeance on behalf of his beloved. In verses 10-16, we'll see Obadiah lay out 4 particular sins against Jacob. Then the following 2 verses describe God's response to his people being sinned against. In this description, the glorious truth that God identifies with his people is crystal clear. Beginning with Abraham, when God declared he would bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him, all the way down to the church age, when Paul was on the road to Damascus to continue his campaign of terror against the early church, Jesus spoke and asked Paul, "Why are you persecuting me?" You see, God identifies with his people, and it is on this basis that he promises to carry out righteous vengeance on behalf of his beloved Jacob when Esau sins against him. So let's look at the text where Obadiah delineates 4 sins Esau committed against Jacob. He failed to come to the aid of his brother. He rejoiced over his brother's ruin. He exploited his brother's calamity. He aided his brother's invaders. So number 1, Esau failed to come to the aid of his brother, and that's in 10 and 11. We read, "Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On that day you stood aloof. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them." In a heinous dereliction of brotherly duties, Esau stood by when Babylon invaded Jacob. What a vivid indictment. While violence is being done to his brother Jacob, Esau stood aloof. It's easy to assume Edom stood aloof because they wanted to avoid Babylon turning their attention to them, but I think there's something more at play. If we look at verse 12, the second sin Obadiah lists is he rejoiced over his brother's ruin. Verse 12 says, "But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress." They boasted and gloated while their brother was ransacked. Maybe this is tied to the pride we covered earlier in verse 3, where they boasted about their lofty dwelling, saying in their heart, "Who will bring me down to the ground?" Maybe they were making fun of the geographical position, the strategic advantage they had with their fortifications and boasting over that. Whatever the case is, they looked on the destruction of Judah, and their response was gloating and rejoicing. And since God identifies with his people, this will not stand. Next, we see verse 13, Esau exploited his brother's calamity. God there says, "Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity." So you see, they took advantage of the invasion, and in the wake of his brother being carried off to exile, Esau descended like a vulture to pick over the bones of whatever was left behind. Though Israel was rightly being punished for going after other gods, that was God's judgment being executed on them. Edom greedily compounded the suffering by plundering them alongside the Babylonians. They sought to profit from their brother's misfortune. Again, God identifies with his people, and this will not stand. The fourth and final charge Obadiah levies against Esau is that he aided his brother's invaders. We see this in verse 14, where God says, "Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress." When some Israelites evaded capture, fleeing the land, fleeing Jerusalem, fleeing the other cities, Edom stood by to seize them and turn them over. Instead of using their lofty dwelling to shelter his brother, Esau turned him over to his captors. The betrayal, the treason there, it's cutting. And it's for these egregious sins, Edom will be cut off forever. As we saw in verses 1-9, God will comprehensively punish their sin. These things they have done will bring shame and reproach to them. Their allies will set a trap beneath them. Yahweh will execute total devastation, bringing them down from the heavens if need be. Esau will be pillaged completely, all his treasures sought out. His wise and mighty men will be slaughtered and utterly destroyed. But it doesn't stop there. Up to this point, Obadiah has employed the phrase "the day" 8 different times, all with negative associations. The day of misfortune, the day of ruin, the day of calamity, the day of distress. But in verse 15, eschatological hope breaks through. In verses 15 and 16, we find the pronouncement of judgment against the nations. The vision Obadiah was given is now revealed to be a part of the judgment Yahweh will bring upon all nations. All who reject him, all who are puffed up with pride, all who sin against his beloved are a part of this picture shown to Obadiah. Verse 15 says, "For the day of Yahweh is near upon all the nations." The day of Yahweh is a day where everyone receives just recompense for their actions. As verses 10-14 showed us, God has kept careful, fastidious accounts of mankind's sin. Nothing escapes his notice. And so he declares in the second half of verse 15, "As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head." This proclamation is God reiterating his promise to Abraham when he promised to curse those who curse him. One commentator said we should see Obadiah, the whole book, as an outworking of God's covenant promise to Abraham in this regard, to bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. See, God's loyalty to his people is on full display in this pronouncement. Coming at the end of the list of sins committed against his beloved, it paints a stark picture of righteous vengeance. And what evil has run amok in our world? Just in the last 2 centuries, we have the Holocaust, we have Stalin and the famines in Russia, we have the great, can't remember what it's called, in China under Mao. Millions of souls lost because of evil dictators, evil men, evil in hearts. We have things happening even now, all different places around the world. There's crackdown on Christians in India. So evil against just the general population, but specifically evil persecution brought against his people. And what is God's response to this? Well, there's a picture in the text, but I'm going to give you an illustration first that sets up that picture. So try to picture this. You've just finished mowing your yard during the peak heat of a sweltering summer day. Just before you mowed your yard, you mowed the yard of your neighbor, the frail, little, kind old lady who lives next door. You're drenched in sweat. Every pore seems to have emptied at least a gallon of sweat. The air is thick with humidity and unmoving without even the whisper of a breeze. Grass clippings coat your shins and your feet like another layer of clothing, which intensify the steamy mugginess. Just then, your neighbor comes outside with an oversized cup and a pitcher of ice water. She hands you the cup, fills it with the cold, clear liquid. She hands it to you and fills it. You can hardly wait until it's full before you take a drink. And how do you take that drink? Do you take a dainty little sip? Just a teaspoonful of water at a time? Of course not. You gulp that water until there's none left. And you do the same every time that sweet little old lady fills up your cup. When you're finished, you've eliminated all evidence there was ever any water brought out to you in the first place. And that's the picture of the punishment for Edom and all of the nations wrong. Let's look at verse 16. "For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow and shall be as if they had never been. Just like that water that you gulp down, God's judgment will completely consume the nations and sinners, and it'll be as if they never existed. Now imagine being an Israelite in exile, hearing this pronouncement of judgment. Would it not bring hope to you in the day of your distress? And similarly, it can bring hope to us as we see suffering all around us, as we experience persecution, as we see evil perpetrated against God and his people. So it contains, verses 10 through 16 contain that confident declaration of God's future activity. He will carry out righteous vengeance on behalf of his beloved. And we can understand how that cultivates restful assurance in us too. God keeps careful accounts of all sin committed against us and against himself. Nothing escapes his notice. To those who have betrayed his people, he will pay the wages for their sin. Now in verses 17 through 21, Obadiah will bring us the third confident declaration of God's future activity, which will cultivate restful assurance in us. Verses 1 through 9, you'll remember, he showed that God will comprehensively punish sin. The second declaration was in 10 through 16. God will carry out righteous vengeance on behalf of his beloved. And the third and final declaration is here in verses 17 through 21. God will bring about complete fulfillment of his promises. Verse 17 starts out with a promise of restoration of Jacob's possessions. Let's read. But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. Verses 19 and 20 flesh out what God means by this when possessing their own possessions. But first, he reiterates his promise to totally annihilate Edom in verse 18. He says, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for Yahweh has spoken. Here, Yahweh reveals his people, the house of Jacob and Joseph, will be agents in the final judgment of the house of Esau. Obadiah and God are likely bringing in the house of Joseph here as an allusion to the splitting of the two kingdoms of his people. He's talking about both working in concert, the remnant being brought together, the reconvening of the nation, and they will be the agents of the final judgment of Esau. And then looking at verse 19, we'll get a fuller picture of what he was talking about in verse 17. And it says, Jacob shall possess his own possessions. He says, those of the Negeb shall possess Mount Esau. Those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negeb. You'll remember that in Genesis 13, God cut a covenant with Abram, with verses 14 and 15 covering God's promise to give Abram and his offspring a specific land. I'll read here. Yahweh said to Abram, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. And he repeated the promise to Isaac and later Jacob. In Genesis 28:13, he says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. So back in Obadiah, verses 17, 19, and 20, in his vision, Yahweh proclaims that he's not forgotten his promise to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not forgotten the promises from hundreds of years prior. Though it might seem like that to those carried off to exile, though it might seem like that for those who have been invaded multiple times, who have had pestering neighbors in the Philistines, who have had treacherous brothers in Edom, God will keep his promises. The house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. Which brings us to the final verse, verse 21, which contains two linked promises. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be Yahweh's. The first promise demonstrates the result of Esau's annihilation. namely that God's people will rule over Mount Esau from Mount Zion. Though the people of Edom are no more, they've been consumed by the house of Jacob, the house of Joseph, as we saw. God's people will rule over the land they once lived in. This also highlights that God's judgment of his people, demonstrated at this time in their exile, is not going to result in their annihilation. It is not a final word. Rather, there will be a remnant who God will install as rulers over the very place which was home to the house of Esau, the house of the treacherous brother. There's a full and final subjugation being described in Obadiah with this capstone comment on the matter. They can have hope even in the midst of being in a foreign land, because God is promising they are going to rule over one of the lands which was what caused them to be in exile in the first place. The second promise, seen in the latter half of verse 21, is that the kingdom shall be Yahweh's. All will be brought under his good and just rule. Yes, there are other rulers which are mentioned. We see saviors will go up and they're going to rule over Mount Zion, or from Mount Zion, they will rule Mount Esau, but they are vice rulers. Yahweh is over all for all eternity. That is what is said. The kingdom shall be the Lord's. The kingdom shall be Yahweh's. It's the same truth proclaimed in Revelation 21, verses 2 through 5. I'm going to read. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who is seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. So this confident declaration, it's from Obadiah all the way stretching to Revelation, God's future complete fulfillment of his promises, produces restful assurance in us because we have been adopted as his sons. We are the citizens of this kingdom he is ruling and reigning over. We know his character. We've been bought by his self-sacrificial love, which took him to the cross. We've experienced his lavish grace and sweet mercy. He works in us even now to conform us to the image of his beloved Son. He is making us more fit for that coming kingdom, which he will rule over. We get excited to think of the day where he will remove all sin and reverse the curse as if it's never existed. We long for his vengeance to be carried out, bringing justice and righting all the wrongs. All evil and all of its effects will be undone. We eagerly await the day when all his promises are fulfilled completely. And Obadiah, the message of the Bible is that God does keep his promises. There is things we have seen in our passage and things on every page that show God does keep his promises. Obadiah shows us that God desires this too. God desires to bring vengeance on behalf of his beloved. God desires to punish sin, and God desires to fulfill all of his promises. He will surely accomplish his will. And so we cry out, Maranatha, Lord, come quickly. Let's close in prayer. Father, you are so good to give us your word. You are so good to give us your word amidst times where it's difficult for us to see the light, difficult for us to see what you are doing, difficult for us to experience the persecution, the effects of sin, local in our own lives, in our own houses. It's difficult for us to see family members turn away from us. And you give us your word and you show us a final hope, an eschatological vision of what your design is for the world. We don't know how you're bringing that about in every instance, but you're good to give us pictures of that and what you've done to Edom, using means that we would never suspect. They never suspected. Lord, help guard us from pridefulness that blinds us. We trust in things that are not you, things that are temporary, not eternal, like you. Help us to turn to your Son and throw ourselves on his mercy and grace every day. Prevent us from being blinded, Lord. Give us hope that you are going to bring full vengeance, full punishment on our behalf for the things done against us. Bring honor to your name, vindicate your holiness. Lord, please come quickly. Amen.